Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, into a world of pointed shoes, itchy wool, and precisely nothing resembling a hairdryer. Welcome, dear sleeper, to the fascinatingly uneventful daily life of a medieval noblewoman. Before we dive into a sea of gently wafting tapestries and moody candlelight, tap that like button before your eyelids press themselves and forget what a button is. Now, let us begin. Imagine, if you will, being born into a world where your birth didn't mean cake and balloons, but rather an immediate calculation of how politically valuable your tiny self might someday be. A world where being noble was less about grandeur and more about an unyielding dedication to embroidery, piety, and strategic boredom. Our noblewoman, let's call her Lady Ethelfrida, for no particular reason, other than that it sounds delightfully lumpy, woke up not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of roosters and the soft creak of castle floorboards under the calloused feet of servants who'd already been awake for hours. Lady Ethelfrida, like most women of her rank in 12th century England, or France, or the Holy Roman Empire, they all shared a certain mossy dampness, slept not on down, but something much crunchier, a mattress stuffed with straw, feathers, or if her family had really made it in the world, coarse wool. Pillows were a gamble. You might get one, or you might just bundle your extra dress and call it luxury. Her chamber was stone-walled and modestly adorned with faded wall hangings depicting biblical scenes, and possibly her Aunt Agnes being martyred by a goat. There was no mirror, of course. Not only were they rare and expensive, but Ethelfrida was expected to aspire to holiness, not vanity. Besides, if she'd seen the state of her hair upon waking, she might have petitioned the Pope for an annulment from it. Now here's where things really start to slow down. After rising, prayer first of course, she would dress, helped by a maid named something wonderful like Beata or Sibylla. Getting dressed was less toss on a hoodie and more brief collaboration between a NASA launch team and a particularly judgmental nun. There were layers, so many layers. First the linen chemise, then a tight-sleeved kirtle, then another dress atop that, maybe a girdle, the belt kind, though nothing was stopping her from being emotionally girded as well. On feast days, she might wear more embroidery than fabric, and certainly more symbols of piety than comfort. Makeup? No, that was for loose women and the French. Instead, Ethelfrida aimed for pallor. The more ghost-like she looked, the closer she was to God. Red cheeks could be achieved through the gentle slapping of the face or a brisk walk past the kitchen fire. And what thrilling adventure awaited this woman of status once dressed? Prayer, again. Then managing the manor, which sounds formal, but included tasks like overseeing the butter inventory and scolding the cook for seasoning the stew with unblessed herbs. She could read, if she was lucky, but only in Latin, which ensured that even her leisure time felt a bit like attending a very long mass, conducted entirely by monks with sinus infections. Meals were social events, though bound by etiquette and a sincere absence of forks. Spoons, dull knives, and a healthy dependence on trenchers, flat hunks of stale bread used as plates, were the norm. Ethelfrida would dine with her husband, Sir Osmond, a man so grounded he once fell asleep standing up during a Marian hymn. Conversation would be slow, respectful, and primarily about land taxes or the state of cousin Wulfric's sheep. But between the prayers, the needlework, and the overseeing of domestic economies, Our Lady found time to stare majestically out of narrow castle windows. not because she was pondering deep philosophical matters, but mostly because the walls were terribly thick and Wi-Fi had not yet been invented. It is worth noting that boredom, rather than being annoying, was something closer to a virtue in her world. Keeping one's mind on God was easier when the only other entertainment was watching the tapestry near the hearth slowly unravel itself over the course of a decade. And so, as the daylight faded, behind a veiling mist that always seemed to descend around 4 in the afternoon, Lady Ethelfreda retired to her chilly chamber, where she might read a passage from a book of saints, scratch leisurely at the wool lining of her sleeves, and then drift off to sleep on a mattress that smelled faintly of old grain and familial obligation. Outside, owls blinked softly from timbered eaves. Inside, dreams came slow but richly woven, like the needlework Ethelfreda left half-finished at her bedside. And so, with the curtain drawn and the hearth barely glowing, we leave her there, just as something quietly unexpected begins to arrive. Chapter 2. The Art of Waking Up When You're a Lady with Servants. Imagine your alarm clock is not a jangly phone or a stuttering rooster, but a quiet knock at the wooden door, followed by the hushed rustle of woolen skirts and the scent of warm rushlights. Welcome to the dawn of a noblewoman in medieval times. A gentle, choreographed production where the first task of the day is waking up as gracefully as possible. Now, it must be said, medieval noblewomen did not leap from bed to check emails or reheat tea 4 times. No, their mornings began not with chaos, but with calm delegation. After all, if you were fortunate enough to be born into land, lace, and lineage, you didn't necessarily get up so much as were slightly elevated from sleep by someone else. Let us picture Lady Aveline of Dunslow, a moderately minor noblewoman with a talent for embroidery and an intense dislike for geese. Her bed, a wooden frame draped with damask and mystery, groans softly at the corners. It is stuffed with straw, perhaps, or goose feathers if autumn was kind, and the local fowl didn't outwit the kitchen staff again. She lies somewhere between dreams of illuminated manuscripts and real-life diplomacy with her vassal's insufferable wife. Then, footsteps. Her maid, quietly trained in the time-honored art of not startling the lady, approaches with a basin of cool water and a whispered greeting in Norman French, because nothing says small talk like a language no one entirely agrees on. Washing up was a solemn affair. No showers, no bubble baths with sea-scented foam. Instead, a bit of perfumed water in a bowl, a soft cloth, and the resigned removal of whatever spiders had crept into one's hair overnight. Castles, for all their prestige, were rather generous landlords to the arachnid community. Next came dressing. This was not a solo venture. Medieval noble women's gowns were complicated, architectural puzzles with buttons, ties, layers, and emotional commitment. One did not simply throw on a kirtle. One entered it like a ceremony. Under everything was the chemise, a lovely linen shift that functioned like pajamas, underpants, and sweat-wicking technology all in one. Over that might go a kirtle, then a surcoat, and finally, if it was a fancier day, a cloaked mantle fastened just so with a brooch the size of a scone. Lacing up sleeves, tying up girdles, ensuring all 40 buttons were secure. This was not a task for those prone to impatience or urgent brunch plans. Lady Aveline might yawn delicately, while her maid adjusted her sleeves, the way you or I might yawn while waiting for the espresso machine to remember its purpose. Hair was another production altogether. Loose hair was for girls, widows, or pre-washing days. A noblewoman wore her hair braided or coiled or entirely out of sight, often beneath a veil, wimple, or that complex pastry-inspired structure called a hennin. It was not uncommon for women to starch their veils into pleasing architectural feats, leading to moments of impressive grace or occasionally wardrobe-related doorframe incidents. Now you may ask, did noblewomen lie about in bed all morning, attended by patient maids, like cats with a title? Quite possibly. But most also had a day full of gentle obligations. A noble household was like an eternal garden party, just with fewer canapes and more concerns about land tax. Aveline's morning might involve checking on the stores of barley, assigning the honey from the latest hive, or judging, which is to say, silently smirking at, the new arrangements of tapestry in the solar. Meals would need overseeing, dogs needed scolding, and someone had spilled lamp oil again near the good pillow. But these events came slowly, and for now, she sits on the edge of her bed, lace in her lap, gazing out over fields still shrouded in morning mist. There's time yet before the steward begins his dull but urgent reports, or her younger cousin starts speaking exclusively in troubadour lyrics after visiting the minstrel again. For now, there is nothing but dawn sifting itself delicately through the arrow-slit window, settling over the cool stone floor like a silk curtain. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the breakfast horn in the distance, and possibly someone screaming about the pigs being loose again. But before the duties of the day descend like a velvet drapery held up by dust and duty, let us linger here just a little longer. Let us see what happens next in the noblewoman's kitchen. Chapter 3 of Embroidery and Epic Patience. Imagine a room, not a grand throne room with banners flapping dramatically in a manufactured breeze, but a small chamber with thick stone walls and tapestries that smell faintly of lavender and damp wool. The kind of room where the fire never quite reaches your toes unless you're nearly sitting on it. This, dear dreamer, is where you'd most likely find a medieval noblewoman in her prime, not riding dragon-shaped carriages or casting love spells in moonlit gardens, but pulling tiny, whisper-thin needles through linen until her fingers went a little numb, her eyes just a little crossed, and her embroidery portfolio became the medieval equivalent of a 9-season Netflix series. Embroidery wasn't just a hobby. Oh no, it was the highest form of respectable feminine expression, second only to pious sighing and overseeing the garden's time patch. Noblewomen stitched with a fervour that almost made one suspect caffeine had already been invented, hidden in the morning ale. They embroidered prayers, family crests, biblical scenes, and once in a while, a particularly cheeky goose. One of the most famous examples is the Bayeux tapestry, though technically it's more of an embroidery, sewn with coloured wool on linen. Dimensions: about 230 feet long, which is roughly an entire football field of conquest, complaints, and pointy medieval hats. While gentlemen skewered each other with swords and accusations, noblewomen portrayed the whole bloody business with wool thread and infinite patience. Now, not every noblewoman stitched great legendary chronicles, of course. Most contented themselves with sweet little altar cloths, decorative samplers, or if they were particularly avant-garde, an embroidered pillow bearing a snarky Latin proverb like, "Fortune favours the well-organised linen closet." Needlework was more than decoration. It was virtue made visible. A woman who sewed was dutiful, quiet, industrious, not sneaking off to jousting matches or flirting with troubadours behind rose bushes. She sat, often perched on a wooden bench so firm it could file your spine, and she stitched, and stitched, and stitched some more. The repetition was meditative, like slicing bread, or waiting for rain, or listening to this very podcast. It wasn't all solitude and stitches, though. Embroidery circles, sort of medieval sewing bees, offered a rare chance for gentle gossip. Picture a stone chamber filled with flickering candlelight, the scent of beeswax and hay, and 5 or 6 noblewomen whispering about Lady Isolde's suspicious new confessor, while they all tried to make a silk peacock, without it looking like a particularly deranged chicken. In these quiet sewing societies, women passed down not just techniques, but stories. Family lore, herbal knowledge, small but useful opinions about the lord of the manor's new beard. Multi-generational wisdom was stitched into every corner of fabric, which is perhaps why noblewomen sometimes looked at their handiwork as if it might glare back. And oh, the materials. Silk from far-off Constantinople, gold thread that glittered unnaturally in firelight, and worsted wool dyed with colours like madder red and woad blue. Richer if you didn't ask what they were made from. Hint: one involves fermented cow urine. Sweet dreams. These textiles were like medieval high fashion, but much pokier and less prone to wardrobe malfunctions. A truly dedicated noblewoman might pack her embroidery like a knight packs chainmail. Whether travelling to a cousin's manor or locked up during a siege, yes, that happened. She had her needles, threads, and hoops ready. Turns out sewing is a surprisingly siege-proof skill. Quiet, portable, and excellent for calming one's nerves while someone catapults a sheep over the castle wall. But in all truth, embroidery was more than utility or embellishment. It was legacy. A noblewoman's stitched work might outlive her by centuries, passed from heir to heir, prayed over during plagues, tugged at by curious little hands too young to be trusted with a needle. Confidence was stitched there, memory, devotion, and perhaps a subtle dig at the bishop, if you knew where to look. So tonight, as you drift softer into slumber, picture a small flickering hearth, woolen embroidery stretched taut in wooden hoops, and a circle of women stitching through the centuries. Quiet companions in the long tapestry of time. The candles grow low now, and somewhere at the edge of the manor, a cat curls into someone's half-finished needlework. Let your thoughts soften with the threads, for after embroidery comes the spice and stir of the noblewoman's kitchen. Chapter 4. The Intricate Art of Doing Nothing, Elegantly. Let us wander, languid and quiet, into the boudoir of Sir Geoffrey's third cousin's wife's niece, Lady Melisande of Avonside, circa 1272. There we find the noblewoman reclining artfully upon a wooden chaise with so many embroidered cushions. One wonders if they were invented not for comfort, but for the excessive display of domestic skill. Because in medieval noblewomaning, a word I swear we should make official, doing nothing was a full-time occupation, and it was rarely done alone. Now, do not mistake nothing for boredom. This was not the modern version, where one checks a parchment scroll only to realize it's not loading because Wi-Fi didn't exist for another 800 years. No, the medieval nothing was a complex, veiled network of gentle activities, all conducted in stone chambers that smelled faintly of beeswax, lavender, and maybe just a hint of damp tapestry. Take, for example, the act of sitting. Yes, truly sitting. This was not a careless flopping onto a chair. This was posture with purpose, a straight spine in a wooden chair with no cushion in sight. Noblewomen were often expected to sit still for inconceivably long stretches, ideally while spinning flax, embroidering saints' faces onto altar cloths, or quietly listening to a minstrel who had only slightly overstayed his welcome. The ability to appear serene while engaging in intense tedium was considered a virtue. It was called grace, but we might reasonably call it advanced level patience. You see, even within the stone-cold quietude of a noble chamber, every clasped hand and downcast gaze told a tiny political story. Noblewomen's days, spent ceremoniously cloaked in wool and the scent of dried herbs, were rarely selfishly theirs. Every sigh had to be tasteful, every yawn politely smothered in linen. Occasionally, this nothing was proudly productive. One popular pastime was embroidery, not the relaxing loop in and hoop sort you might find in a modern hobby store, but big, sprawling tapestries illustrating biblical epics, the lives of saints, or, when things got wild, a hunting scene featuring deer that looked suspiciously like poorly drawn dogs. Young noblewomen were expected to spend their time stitching virtue into fabric, with every little needle prick another silent plea for social prestige and, ideally, a good marriage. And what a grand irony! Embroidery was a quiet form of courtly power. Whispered alliances were sewn into the borders. Matches were made over bobbins of thread. Gossip passed smoother through thread than over tongues, lest tongues be accused of wagging too freely. A lady's embroidery needle might well be sharper than a knight's blade. Only hers drew blood far more discreetly, and generally only from her own pinky. But doing nothing elegantly extended beyond the domestic arts. There were also rules for how one ought to walk, how one must incline the head in conversation, how to sip wine without slurping. Slow, deliberate movements were the hallmark of nobility. A noblewoman busting into a room at anything above a glacial pace would be deemed not just gauche, but borderline scandalous. In this sense, the entire life of a noblewoman resembled an endless stately dance, just without music, movement, or the fun. Bathing, too, fell under the jurisdiction of doing nothing, as a luxurious ritual rather than a necessity. Despite our assumptions of medieval filth, some noble women took their bathing very seriously indeed. Not frequently, heavens no, but very thoroughly. They were helped into large wooden tubs with scented waters, often warmed by the fire or by a particularly huffing servant. Rose petals floated lazily atop the surface for no other purpose than to briefly distract one from pondering philosophical questions regarding bodily odor. And while one might assume that bathing was a brief affair, it could in fact be a multi-hour opportunity for tea, treats, servants reading poetry aloud, or, should the lady be particularly ambitious, writing letters, probably requesting more herbs. Now, you may notice, throughout all this, barely a toe has been stepped outside. Even birds got more mileage than most noble women. There were gardens, of course, where they might walk slowly among the lavender or watch bees with great deliberation. But most days were spent indoors, windows shuttered, candles flickering, and the scent of old stone and slow hours wrapping around them like a woolen shawl. Gentle listener, let your breath match the peaceful pace of Lady Melisand's day. Her mornings were quiet and structured, her afternoons cloudy with contemplation, her evenings lit by oil lamps and gentle sighs. She may have been doing nothing, but wasn't she doing it exquisitely? And now, let us drift into our own stillness as our next dream door opens softly on the rituals of noble upbringing, where childhood was anything but childish. Chapter 5. The Noblewoman's Wardrobe, a fortress of fabric and fuss. If you ever find yourself drifting through a medieval castle, past the flickering torches and the faint scent of dried herbs, you might hear a soft rustling from behind a heavy oak door. No, it's not a ghost, probably. It's more likely a noblewoman wrestling yet again with her wardrobe, which, in the 14th century, functioned less like a closet and more like a curated museum of sleeves. Yes, sleeves. Those detachable, swappable conversation starters that fluttered like banners and tied life together, quite literally. Let's gently unfold the cerulean world of a medieval noblewoman's clothing, layer by lulling layer, to understand the typical morning in Lady Idanea's life. And yes, that was an actual name, not a sneeze. We must start with wool, linen, and prayer. Rising with the sun and the rooster's unsolicited opinion, Lady Idanea would first be attended by a maid or two, who brought her a basin of water and perhaps a quick update on the weather. This involved looking at the sky. Weather forecasting was simpler in the 1300s. Now came the dressing. First, the smock or chemise. This was the linen underlayer worn closest to the skin, changed and washed far more often than the outer layers. At night, it doubled as sleepwear, and during the day, it served as a noblewoman's first line of defense against all things itchy and unmentionable. Over the smock came the kirtle, a long dress with fitted sleeves and just enough structure to hint that corsets were a few centuries away from ruining everyone's posture. The kirtle was often brightly dyed, if she could afford it, using natural ingredients like madder root for red, woad for blue, or onion skins for, well, onion-coloured. To the modern listener, this may sound like organising your colour palette using a soup recipe, but we're only halfway dressed. The overgown, sometimes called a surcoat, might be slung on top like draped nobility. If you've ever seen a historical portrait and wondered how much fabric could possibly be gathered into one outfit, you're imagining this correctly. Fabric was wealth, and the more of it you could afford to drag around court, the more status you had, even if it meant inching through doorways sideways like a wide-eyed tapestry. Then came the accessories, because fashion waits for no feudalism. Belts to cinch, brooches made of pewter, bronze, or, if you had the good fortune to marry a man with a decent tax situation, perhaps silver. These brooches didn't merely fasten sleeves, they announced your mood. A heart-shaped pin might say, "I'm betrothed," while a dragon-shaped one might say, "I eat betrothals for breakfast." Now, about those sleeves. They were detachable, flamboyant, and prone to mischief. Embroidered with patterns scalloped along the edges, sometimes slashed to reveal fine silk beneath. These sleeves were traded like calling cards among noblewomen. Lady Idanea might loan hers to her sister-in-law, Lady Fremondine, for a feast, who would return them slightly more wine-stained and with a whispered tale of admiration from a visiting knight. Fashion and intrigue, sewn snug under the armpit. If it was winter, add a fur-lined mantle. If it was summer, keep the mantle, because social expectations were unforgiving, and the risk of melting was mildly preferable to appearing insufficiently draped. Beauty, as always, required mild suffering, plus 4 layers of heat-trapping textiles, and of course, the iconic headdress, ranging from simple linen veils to complex cage structures that could double as birdhouses. These headdresses reflected a lady's age, marital status, and geographic origin. In some courts, towering conical hennins, yes, those fairy tale party hats, were the rage, though balancing one required the posture of a Greek statue and the neck strength of a prize ox. Dressing could take a full hour or more, but it wasn't just about clothing. It was ceremony. It gave time for prayer, small gossip, and the kind of gentle chatter that made castles feel slightly less drafty. It was a quiet moment of control in a world of arranged marriages, political feasts, and embroidery that never ever ended. As the final gown was smoothed and the last pin tucked into place, Lady Idenea would glance at her reflection in the polished bronze mirror and sigh, not from vanity, but from the sheer weight of her ensemble. She was now ready to go sit down and remain mostly stately for several hours. And while Lady Idenea rustles off toward her wooden chair with great ceremony and slightly tangled hems, perhaps we too are ready to follow her, softly, quietly, toward her next daily ritual, the noblewoman's most hallowed pastime. A gentle, unhurried meal. Let's peer next into the candlelit stillness of the great hall's midday hush, where spoons, if lucky, might meet something more delicious than boiled barley. Chapter 6. Embroidery, Gossip, and the Whisper of Linen. Here, in the stillness of stone halls lit by buttery candlelight, we find one of the most misunderstood battlegrounds of the medieval world, the embroidery chamber. It is not the clang of swords or the gallop of horses that echoes in this hallowed space. No, this is where noblewomen, draped in layers of wool and patience, met their daily obligations with needle in hand and secrets on their tongues. The embroidery room was the quiet heart of many a noble household, tucked away off the solar, the family's private quarters, and often smelling faintly of lavender sachets, tallow smoke, and the faintest scent of eternal waiting. Here, among wooden hoops, dyed threads, and cushions flattened from generations of noble posteriors, medieval women stitched while the world changed around them, very slowly and rarely for the better. Now, let us picture Lady Isabel of Winalcher, a woman of impeccable lineage, a forehead taller than most, and a temper that only the Lord himself dared challenge. Each morning, after the ritual struggling of gowns over corsets, worn not for vanity, but the deep, bone-supported need to keep upright in a stiff social order, Lady Isabel would make her stately way to the embroidery room. There, gathering like moths to a flickering hearth fire, came her companions. Lady Aldith, whose fingers never stopped moving, but whose eyes wandered into other people's business more than her thread. Dame Celestria, renowned more for her ability to invent scandalous allegories than for actually completing anything. And dear, dreamy Rosamond, whose sampler had said, "Berceuse, Berceuse," for the past 6 fortnights, as though she were attempting to stitch a lullaby directly into the weave. Embroidery, for all its quietude, was both a duty and a language. Noblewomen were expected to produce textiles not only for aesthetic and devotional purposes, but also as political statements. If a woman embroidered a tapestry of St. Margaret triumphing over a dragon, it was devotional. If she embroidered St. Margaret triumphing over a dragon that bore a suspicious resemblance to her husband's new steward, it was commentary. The subjects of their work neatly paralleled their mixed ambitions. Saints, flowers, heraldic beasts, and the occasional accurate enough likeness of a particularly dashing troubadour seen last autumn. In rare moments, a piece might find its way into the priest's hands to decorate the altar, or more often, to rest moth-bitten in the back of a dowry chest beside pressed herbs and long-forgotten promises. Most crucial, however, was the talking. For while the needle danced between linen threads, tongues moved with equal dexterity. It was in these rooms that news spread. Who had taken ill? Who had taken a lover? Who had taken offence at last week's supper seating, where Lady Anne had gotten foreign pepper, and would she let anyone near it? And whether the new Baron's teeth really were filed into points. Gossip was a form of survival, wrapped in gauze and seasoned with civility. A tactful noblewoman could ruin someone's reputation with a look, a slightly raised eyebrow, and a yes, certainly odd how often she visits the chapel, considering. could do more than a fleet of knights. But lest we think embroidery rooms were only nests of intrigue and silk, let us not forget their tender stillness. There is something timeless in the rhythm of hand stitching, the measured patience of someone creating beauty a quarter inch at a time, the hiss of thread through fabric, the soft thud of a rolled spool hitting the stone floor, the occasional sneeze from someone who'd snuggled too close to the drying herbs. It was a lullaby of its own. And when the sun slanted just right through the thick paned glass, the women's faces glowed gold, like icons, like saints at rest. Only the glint of scissors betrayed their earthly attachments. Lady Isabel herself, never quite able to get her dragon's head symmetrical, often paused in the middle of her work to sigh. Well, perhaps it's a metaphor. And no one ever asked her to clarify what for. It was understood. But even in such softness, the daily needs loomed. Textiles were required, not just for elegance and religious observance, but for practical use too. Linens had to be embroidered to mark them as noble property, lest a lower-born towel get ideas. So it was back to stitching, back to quiet talk, back to the tender ritual of making something useful, wrapped in something beautiful. The light fades now in their embroidery room. Let us tiptoe out while they argue softly about sheep's wool versus silk thread, and whether Brother Matthew's sermons were intended to be that sleepy. There's another chamber waiting, filled with sweet scents and steamy disputes. But that is where we'll drift next. Chapter 7. The slow affairs of wardrobe rooms and wool. There's a tender rhythm to the sound of wool being carded, a shushing lullaby in the hands of time. In the remote corners of medieval manor houses, noblewomen of high birth weren't just accumulating status and suspiciously pointy headwear. They were quietly at the heart of what we might now call textile management. This chapter, dear listener, is spun like soft flax into linen and devoted to the gentle yet ceaseless world of medieval noblewomen's wardrobes. First, let us paint the setting. Imagine a chamber with thick stone walls and tiny, arrow-slit windows. A low fire flickers in the hearth, barely, competing with the chill of English fog. Overhead, the beams are strung with drying herbs. The scent, a dreamy combination of thyme, lavender, and the occasional wet dog. This isn't a fashion boutique, but it is the medieval equivalent. The wardrobe room. Half closet, half accounting office, all the rage in the year 1270. You see, noblewomen didn't merely wear clothes, they governed them. Entire inventories of linen undershirts, silk surcoats, velvet hoods, and fur-lined cloaks had to be meticulously tracked. And by meticulously, we mean that Lady Joan of Kent probably had to check if her ermine trim hadn't walked off with her maid. Now, for the medieval noblewoman, clothing was not just a matter of modesty or those weird sumptuary laws that dictated a peasant must look appropriately unimpressed. No, garments were a show of wealth, piety, status, and how convincingly one could manage a small kingdom of laundry. A richly layered outfit could involve upwards of 7 components. Let's count them together sleepily. 1. A linen chemise, your base layer, comfy and washable, the medieval version of pajamas that never came off. 2. A kirtle, somewhere between a slip and a dress, but with more historical gravitas. 3. A surcoat, sleeveless, fashion-forward, and occasionally alarming in fabric choice. 4. Hose, yes, even women wore them, though modesty dictated that they remain sensibly hidden beneath 5 pounds of skirt. 5. Girdle, not for slimming, but for carrying pouches, prayer beads, or in some cases, disgruntled cats. 6. Wimple and veil, headwear secured by pins sharp enough to defend one's honor. 7. And finally, shoes made of cloth, leather, or, if one was particularly unlucky, wooden patterns designed to clack dramatically down stone corridors. Now imagine every one of those garments being hand-stitched, possibly embroidered with scenes from the Bible or a hedgehog in a bishop's mitre. Artistic freedom was a medieval virtue. Noblewomen often oversaw this sewing themselves, especially during long winters, when embroidery served both as meditation and medieval Netflix, though they rarely did the stitching with their own noble fingers. That's what maids and seamstresses were for. Many ladies were intimately involved in the design, the fabrics, and yes, the politics of cloth. A bolt of imported silk from Lucca or Antioch could do more to raise eyebrows at court than any scandalous romance. Even managing wool required cunning. Spun wool had to be stored dry to avoid mould, a lesson learned only once by Lady Isolde of Pembroke after a disastrous attempt to hide a love letter inside a bale of fleece. The letter fermented, the romance did not. And behind every gorgeous gown stood an army of women, maids, spinners, dyers, fullers. Those are the folks who stomped in tubs of urine to soften wool. May they rest with well-laundered souls. And Lady Eleanor or Margaret or Agnes, checking up on them all with a ledger thicker than a winter cloak. Garments were passed down, altered and repurposed. A faded kirtle might become a child's doublet, or be dyed blue with woad and turned into a cloak. Even worn-out linens would enjoy an afterlife as bandages or bookmarks or, if torn just right, ghost costumes for All Hallows' Eve. Economical, extremely. Spooky, slightly. Contrary to what court painters suggest, noblewomen did not dress up daily in gold-threaded gowns to sit by a window gazing at roses. Most days, they dressed practically, which in medieval England meant putting on an outfit that weighed as much as a confessional booth and still being expected to curtsy. So next time you sigh at folding a week's worth of laundry, remember Lady Maud of Essex, who once had to coordinate the laundering schedule of a household with 12 nobles, 16 servants, a bishop in disguise, and 2 peacocks, folding fitted sheets. Medieval dream. As our spindle of time winds down tonight, and the soft rustle of fabric mingles with the hush of history, close your eyes and imagine silk-hem footsteps down candle-lit halls, because next we'll slip gently from garments to gardens, where noblewomen turn dirt, seeds, and celestial calendars into surprisingly tasty stews, with only occasional witchcraft. Chapter 8. The languid language of love letters and loom weights. If you close your eyes and listen closely to the rustle of parchment and the delicate clack of wooden bobbins, you might just hear the most tantalizing flirtation of the 13th century, embroidered into linen and sealed with wax. Tonight, we peek into the peculiar poetry and practical pastimes that filled the noblewoman's quieter hours, where the thrum of a spinning wheel might be the soundtrack to a courtly crush. Noblewomen, though rarely the ones to gallop into battle or make sweeping declarations in smoky halls, had their own arsenal of romantic weaponry, quills, embroidery needles, and the most suggestive use of Latin conjugation this side of a monastery. Let us set our scene in the solar. That's not a contemporary panel of sun-gathering innovation, no. The medieval solar was a private and relatively sunlit chamber, a rare treat in the stone labyrinths of manorial estates. It was here, beneath tapestries and beside hearths, that the noblewomen engaged in 2 deeply medieval pastimes, weaving and waxing romantic. Embroidery, for instance, was not just an act of practical needlework, it was a language. When a noblewoman stitched a falcon onto a handkerchief, it didn't merely say, "I like birds." It suggested chivalrous love, pursuit, devotion. A rose might suggest secrecy. A vine could hint at longing entanglements. And a heart, yes, actual anatomically concerning shapes resembling hearts, spoke the universal language of, "I stitched this, and I rather like you." Now, somewhere amid the thread and whisper, were the love letters. Ah, yes. Written, not always by the lady herself, mind you. Literacy was patchy, and Latin a tricksy beast, but often dictated to a scribe and carefully phrased to sound both demure and devastatingly flirtatious. Imagine this. A noblewoman sits by candlelight, a stubby tallow candle, mind you, that smells vaguely of mutton and melancholy. She's composing a missive to a certain Sir Geoffrey, who managed to drop his silk glove near the bakehouse in what was either an accident or the most dramatic gesture of the month. The letter might begin, "To my most noble and gentle knight, whose favour I tuck beneath my sleeve as I do my embroidery needles," and it might end with something like, "May Our Lady keep you, and may your lance be ever victorious." Now, for the untrained modern ear, that might sound like a blend of piety and equestrian equipment. But in medieval courtly code, it was positively sizzling. The lance was a metaphor, you see. Most things were. While courtly love lingered in letters, so too did affection linger in daily chores. Weaving, particularly on tapestry looms, was not idle work. A noblewoman might spend seasons crafting a gift or household banner, one that declared not just her family's symbols, but whispered of her domestic diligence, artistic sensibilities, and uncanny ability to keep the loom from collapsing during damp weather. Now that, dear listener, is commitment. Let's not forget that inside each woven panel, there might be hidden initials. Not her own, no, that would be gauche, but his. Disguised perhaps as a decorative knot or a conveniently crooked vine. Medieval espionage, but with yarn. Of course, for all the fanciful flirtation, many noblewomen were already married, often alarmingly young, and to suits of armour who also owned estates. Yet, within the bounds of these arranged unions, letters and crafts were ways to conjure a gentler, often imaginary world. A realm where affection could be embroidered, sent by messenger, and reimagined in the pages of troubadour poetry. Evenings might melt into moments like these. A lady seated at her frame, carefully selecting floss, humming a French love ballad beneath her breath. One passed on by her mother's mother, of a knight who chopped down 12 oaks just to get a glance at a maiden who once sneezed in his direction. It's all terribly romantic, in that slow, slightly draughty, herb-scented way unique to medieval manor life. Outside, the evening fog pools along the cobbled edge of the chapel wall. Inside, the fire hisses as the last log sighs into embers. The love letter, composed, sealed in beeswax, and artfully perfumed with rosemary, will travel 7 miles by donkey in hopes of arriving dry. The tapestry, half finished, curls slightly on its frame, awaiting the morning light. And in the hush of candle-snuffed darkness, the noblewoman dreams, not of battles or banquets, but of the next thread she'll choose, the next word she'll write, and the proper Latin for, "You make my heart flutter like a startled chicken." Now hush, soft dreamer. For in the morning, the noblewoman must tend not only to love's whispered trifles, but to something even more daunting, the linen ledger. Let's drift there next. Chapter 9. The Art of Doing Nothing Elegantly. There is a certain kind of poetry to stillness. In the medieval world, where things clanged, creaked, and occasionally exploded due to mysterious herbs, noblewomen were expected to master the fine art of refined idleness. But let us not confuse doing nothing with being unproductive. On the contrary, a noblewoman's leisure was often among her most carefully managed performances. As the morning sun dragged its yawn across the grey stone flagstones, Lady Idonia of Glemsford would rise not with a jolt, but with ceremony, awakened not by screeching birds or dreadful alarm clocks, but by the gentle ministrations of a maid pulling back heavy curtains and murmuring something like, "It appears the sky has remembered how to be blue, milady." A few calculated sighs, a slight stretch of the fingers, a delicate foot swinging out of bed, and thus began a day that was quite full of nothing. Because to be idle, as a medieval noblewoman, was often a luxury available only to those of tremendous fortune and even grander titles. Peasant women may have been busy until they collapsed into their hay bales, but Lady Idonia, she had to choose between watching embroidery in progress or watching the goose pond. Decisions. You see, in many noble courts, activity without purpose violated the code of aristocratic elegance. Spinning wool all day, far too industrious, but sitting beside someone who's spinning, sipping watered spiced wine, nodding occasionally as you comment on the angle of the thread. Now that was decorum. Afternoons might involve what medieval handbooks called honourable pastimes, carding one's hair with ivory combs, listening to distant lute music, or the ever-thrilling drama of watching two squirrels fight on the battlement ledge. Occasionally, justice must be dispensed. For example, denying the cat access to the solar because it had the impudence to nap on the embroidery frame. A firm but polite decree. Sometimes these periods of rest included what was known as chambering, which sounds more dramatic than it was. Chambering, for noble women, simply meant staying in one's private rooms, not necessarily asleep, but drifting in that shadowy country between wakefulness and dreaming. A place where deep thoughts mingled with silly ones, and time itself seemed to curl up like a cat at the foot of your bed. Lady Idonia would often ruminate on philosophical conundrums that really didn't go anywhere. Why do men always smell faintly of onion? Was God's greatest work the trout or the tapestry? If a bard sings in the forest and no one hears him, is it still a sin if he warbles in D minor? And yet, despite appearances, such idleness was never truly idle. To be seen doing nothing with grace was its own form of power. It said, "I am above the frantic scurrying of the world." It whispered, "I have time enough to spare, time to ponder, to observe, to recline like a Roman on loan." In a world of ceaseless toil for the many, serenity itself became a kind of wealth. Visitors to the manor might occasionally mutter that the lady of the house never lifts a finger. That may have been true, but each unmoved finger was part of a greater performance. Each calm expression, each slow turn of the head toward a window, each inspection of a beetle crawling across the stone lintel, all signalled leisure so supreme that mere existence became an art form. To be fair, there were limits. 5 days in a row of chambering and speculation about squirrels could create a certain ennui. That was when noblewomen turned to the subtle strategy of planned busyness. For example, redistributing their medieval Netflix queue. Instead of the embroidery on Thursday, they might rearrange the buckle ribbons on their girdle belt. Perhaps plan a fictitious hunt where no hunting took place, but much feasting happened nonetheless. It was a life of understated complexity, a dance between public dignity and personal daydreams, between social performance and genuine escape. The idle hours may not have teemed with noise or recordable achievements, but they thickened like warm porridge, dense with unspoken reflection. And in those long hours of doing nearly nothing, a noblewoman might look out the window, watching the wind tangle the ivy on the chapel wall, wondering what it all meant, or if it needed to mean anything at all. Now, as the sun dips behind the courtyard's worn statues, and another day of dignified idleness folds itself into a twilight robe, we turn softly toward the hushed corridors of leisure's twin, letter writing, where feelings, rumours, and pressing questions about onion-scented men are quietly committed to parchment. Chapter 10. The Art of Proper Idleness, Leisure, Noblewoman Style. Ah, leisure, that most luxurious of pastimes in a world filled with plagues, pigs, long prayers, and longer winters. For the medieval noblewoman, leisure was not simply a break in duty, it was a duty. A peculiar paradox which meant that even relaxing had to be undertaken with all due decorum, layering a faint comedy onto the concept of free time. Now, this wasn't the type of leisure that involved lounging by a pool with something fruity and slightly irresponsible in a goblet. This was serious leisure, elevated idleness, the kind that might be embroidered, sung about in minor keys, or sighed through whilst posing near a window with a copy of Boethius. To understand her leisure, one must consider the tools of the trade, chief among them embroidery hoops, delicate needles, and a patience so profound it could tame time itself. Noblewomen embroidered not merely for pleasure, but to display virtue, the gentlewoman's equivalent of a resume, except sewn with saints and stylized flowers. These works might be gifted, displayed, or quietly judged by visiting in-laws. While the hand stitched, the mind wandered, often to stories of saints, prayers, or wondering quietly why no one had invented wool that didn't itch. Then there were games, which were less go fish and more let's rename all the saints in order of martyrdom. Tabletop amusements included chess, which offered an elegant way to socially battle men without leaving the drawing room, or the boundaries of gender-normative behaviour. A noblewoman adept at chess was considered intelligent, cunning, and perhaps slightly intimidating, though she never let on. One raised eyebrow during a well-placed rook move spoke volumes. I may not inherit the manner, Reginald, but I can checkmate your ego. Music, too, filled these still hours. Many noblewomen were taught to play stringed instruments like the lute, the harp, or the psaltery, each requiring both dexterity and decorum. Singing was encouraged, though rarely in the raucous, tavern-born style of the common folk. No noble womanly vocals were reserved for mournful ballads and courtly love songs, often delivered with the gravity of a soul who had never once stubbed her toe. Reading, of course, was another cherished pastime, for those who could. Literacy among noblewomen varied, depending largely on geography, period, and the family's opinion on whether letters might inspire troublesome ideas. But when permitted, books, usually in Latin or French and painstakingly hand-copied, offered entire mental landscapes. A favourite was the Book of Hours, a devotional calendar with prayers, psalms, and miniatures of angels who all suspiciously resembled the artist's cousin. These books were personal, precious, and portable, like a medieval Kindle, but with more gold leaf and fewer horse jokes. When the weather was fair, outdoor leisure became an event. Gardens were walked in, not for exercise, of course, heavens no, but for reflection. A noblewoman might pause near a rosebush and sigh meaningfully. This was not melodrama. This was mood. Appropriate emotional responses to flora included wistfulness, divine gratitude, or a gentle melancholy suitable for composing mental poetry that would never leave one's lips. Hawking was another curious leisure pursuit, where noblewomen donned gloves heavier than their dignity and coaxed birds of prey into aristocratic cooperation. A well-trained falcon was not merely a pet, but a fashion statement with wings. Watching one's falcon chase down a rabbit across dewy meadow grass was considered both spiritually invigorating and vaguely flirtatious if there were knights watching. Even leisure had a social pecking order. The Queen's favourite pastime might become fashionable overnight, while last year's court obsession, say, sculpting devotional candles shaped like apostles, would quietly be shelved with the rest of history's odd hobbies. But truly, leisure wasn't about doing nothing. It was about doing something graceful, decorative, and publicly underwhelming. To be still, but beautifully so. To engage the hands while the mind pondered loftier things, whether the Virgin Mary ever got bored, or if Brother Thomas would stop preaching about hell long enough to enjoy the roses. So as evening closes over the manor and the embroidered moon is lit by real candlelight, our noblewoman smooths the edge of her latest sampler, sips a curiously weak herbal tisane, and considers, if only briefly, the joy of contemplative idleness. Next, we drift quietly through the corridors of contemplation, where devotion lives not in thunderclaps of faith, but in hushed prayers and sacred repetition. Chapter 11. The Velvet Whispers of Embroidery. In the gentle hush of a manor's solar, that sunlit sitting room where noblewomen gathered when the weather dared to be kind, threads danced slowly across hoops, and time itself seemed to stitch its way forward, one sleepy loop at a time. Yes, embroidery, the noble pastime of noblewomen, threading beauty into boredom with the patience of a saint and the wrist strength of a falconer. It was not merely decorative needlework, but a sort of domestic spellcraft, a way of taming both time and textiles. Let us drift now into Lady Alison's solar, a wide, wooden-beamed chamber smelling faintly of lavender, warm wool, and whatever bees left behind in the wax candles. To watch the quiet ballet of stitched birds and saints and improbable-looking dragons coming to life beneath centuries of contemplative fingers. Lady Alison is a fictional construct, of course, but she's a helpful vessel for exploring such mundanity. Picture her with carefully smoothed hair, a gown of modest but entirely impractical sleeves so drapey they may eat a spoon, and a lap serving as both cushion and canvas. Medieval noblewomen were not, contrary to modern beliefs, always at a feast or in the throes of courtly love. More often, their days were stitched together quite literally, with tapestries, altar cloths, and decorative panels that made the chilly stone interiors of castles feel slightly less like fashionable dungeons. Embroidery was more than homemaking. It was a sign of piety and prestige. A well-embroidered wall hanging declared both your faith and your family name. It also conveniently kept out the relentless cold air that seemed to consider stone walls nothing more than a gentle suggestion. Rich fabrics like silk, gold thread, and even pearls were used by those with coin enough to ruin their backs over them. Imagine lean, elegant fingers working tiny gold threads through velvet so plush it might as well have been winter incarnate. A stitch here, a sigh there, the rare clumsy curse when the thread tangled like last year's harvest. Indeed, embroidery demanded the subtle skills of meditation, concentration strong enough to keep the pattern, but not so much that one remembered the political woes of the manor, or the fact that there were at least 4 generations of crumbs trapped in the tapestry behind her chair. And it wasn't all birds and vines, oh no. Many embroideries were storytelling, medieval Netflix, but quieter and slightly scratchier. Biblical tales, knightly sagas, or allegorical beasts who looked oddly fond of smirking, all rendered in thread. These pieces spoke silently of loyalty, faith, or perhaps just an artist who had never seen a real lion. Much of this needlework was collaborative. Think of it as medieval group therapy, if therapy involved more thread counts than emotional breakthroughs. Noblewomen would gather, humming low tunes, drinking warm cider or mead, if they could sneak it. Not so much gossiping as exchanging tidbits with the energy of people who cannot leave the castle, and whose brothers are endlessly terrible at sword-based diplomacy. There was also the pride in creating something lasting. Every stitch, even slightly crooked ones shaped like a goose that had seen too much, wrapped the maker into a long line of women who stitched before her. It was, quite literally, legacy you could hang on the wall. Moreover, a noblewoman's embroidering hand spoke volumes during betrothal negotiations. A particularly tidy cross-stitch might be hailed as evidence of good breeding. A tapestry-sized piece could demonstrate patience, skill, and a general warning to any future husband that she could, if she desired, stitch his coat closed for the entire Advent season. Soon, these embroidered works travelled across monasteries, into churches, over the English Channel, telling quiet tales with louder threads. Sometimes they were gifted, sometimes stolen, as in the spirited, though quite terribly documented wars of embroidery acquisition between various duchesses. And always, these pieces carried the finger memories of the women who made them. So here sits Lady Alison, head tilted slightly, her needle tracing a star onto deep green wool. Around her, the ladies work in murmured harmony, their voices low, the fabric rustling like soft wind in a forest full of secrets. Outside, the sun slides lazily down the sky like old honey, and the castle turrets are bathed in orange dreams. Inside, in the hush of the solar, stories are sewn thread by golden thread, while the world tiptoes around on tiptoe, which brings us gently forward, just a step, no sudden movements, to the question of rest and reverence. For where there's embroidery, there's most certainly chapel, and who better than a noble woman to elevate piety into a poetic hobby? Let's wander quietly into her spiritual world. Chapter 12. Embroidered Intrigue and the Secret Language of Thread. In a quiet corner of the castle, where the draught never quite made it, and the window ledges were too narrow even for pigeons to loiter, medieval noblewomen gathered with needles in hand, staring down not armies, but sampler cloths. Yes, noble or near noble ladies, destined to marry into alliances or mysteries, spent long hours engaged in that most virtuous and whisper-quiet pursuit, embroidery. This chapter, my dear sleepy traveller, is stitched together from silken facts and the occasional gold thread of witty detail. Lie back, perhaps under a humble throw pillow, embroidered by no one in particular, and join us as we unravel a past sewn in samplers and silence. For many noble women, embroidery was more than hobby. It was expectation. It taught patience without a single sermon, obedience without overt messaging, and gave the sort of hand-eye coordination once reserved for archery, but with far fewer injuries, except for maybe the occasional pierced thumb. But embroidery wasn't just about roses and saints. Oh no. Hidden in the margins of biblical scenes were quiet protests and subtle jokes. A serpent might resemble someone's tedious distant cousin. A falcon, oddly familiar in the beak, mirrored the lady of the household. And once, though unproven, a suspiciously smug sheep appeared in the hem of a priest's altar cloth, allegedly to make a point about long-winded sermons. Young ladies were expected to master the needle by their early teens, often overseen by governesses so quiet they practically communicated in sighs. Samplers, those tidy cloths decorated with letters, flowers, and just a hint of personal flair, were essentially a medieval LinkedIn profile. Look at me. I can sew a tulip. I pay attention to detail. I can copy out proverbs in cross-stitch without complaining. But as the evening hours grew longer, especially in winter, when the sun sort of gave up by 4 in the afternoon, many noblewomen turned their embroidery circles into quiet councils. Without television, mobile phones, or scrollable distraction, they turned to tapestries. These weren't merely wall decor. These massive, woolly masterpieces served 3 noble purposes: insulating the drafty stone walls, showing off the household's wealth and morals, and of course, discreet gossip. There wasn't a stitch sewn that didn't carry a whisper. That unicorn, perhaps a metaphor for Lady Margaret's elusive betrothed, the maiden beside him, definitely modelled after a nearby duchess's daughter who had recently taken ill, a phrase meaning everything and nothing in equal parts. It was, after all, during these hours with thread in hand and mouths full of scones, carefully crumb-free while stitching, that stories travelled. Rumours were embroidered in more vividly than the actual motifs. Who had engaged in a forbidden romance? Who had fallen off her horse, or worse, into favour? There's even documentation of noblewomen using coded motifs, like particular arrangements of flowers or animals, to communicate beneath their husbands' noses. A forget-me-not paired with a sleeping dog might hint at unrequited love, or perhaps indigestion. It's hard to say. Even queens partook. Eleanor of Castile, for example, stitched masterfully and gifted embroidered items as diplomatic gestures. Not unlike gifting someone a fancy tea towel today, except with international consequences. Of course, not every needlewoman had aspirations of art or espionage. Many found genuine comfort in the repetitive rhythm of the stitch. Over-under, over-under, like a soft lullaby for the hands. The joy was not always in the finished product, but in the making of it. The warmth of wool in winter, the hush of conversation among friends, the faint smell of candles and lavender sachets tucked into sleeves. And so, the noblewomen embroidered, day after day, year after year, not always out of necessity or ambition, but sometimes simply to pass the time in a world that moved slowly, royally slowly, and had no Netflix to speak of. And in those modest hands were held centuries of quiet rebellion, practiced patience, and the kind of endurance only a truly committed stitcher understands. Now rest, dear dreamer, for soon we shall fold away our needlework and step gently into the hallowed realm of herbal gardens, where a noblewoman's best armour might have been a well-placed rosemary sprig and a correctly measured tincture of poppy. But for now, close your eyes and imagine the faint sound of satin gliding through linen as the stars begin their patient embroidery across the night sky. Chapter 13. Embroidery, Gossip, and the Noblewoman's Secret Weapon. By the soft flicker of a beeswax candle and the distant sigh of a castle draught slipping through stone corridors, the noblewomen of medieval Europe settled into the underrated art of waiting. Waiting, mind you, was their full-time occupation, though it often came disguised as embroidery. Now we mustn't be fooled by modern cross-stitching kits featuring cats in teacups. Medieval embroidery was the quiet battlefield of noblewomen, their threads sharper than swords, and their designs more revealing than any political scroll. In a world swirling with court intrigue and lineage debates, the act of stitching a scene from St. Margaret's legendary dragon slaying was both a pious pastime and an excellent way to signal your dynasty's opinion on dragons or metaphorical in-laws. Lady Aveline of Yorkshire, for instance, once embroidered a tapestry so artfully passive-aggressive that it effectively ended a land dispute with her sister-in-law simply by depicting a considerably larger manor house beneath her own family crest. Historians still aren't sure if this was a divine miracle or textile-based diplomacy, but embroidery was more than symbolic mess-making. It was also uniquely meditative. A noblewoman might spend 8 hours a day threading silk or gold wire through velvet, a feat that sounds both delicate and faintly masochistic. Her calloused fingers, however, were strong, precise, and perpetually occupied, which made them quite handy for avoiding eye contact during awkward banquets. You see, in a medieval hall filled with political tension and suspiciously overcooked venison, holding an embroidery hoop gave one the dignified excuse not to participate in whatever scandal was unfolding across the table. Or more precisely, it bought time to listen without being accused of listening. Indeed, listening was the noblewoman's quiet triumph. Gossip fluttered through freezing stone halls like smoke from peat fires, and women became masters at weaving it into something useful, sometimes literally. One baroness in the Rhineland is rumoured to have stitched coded messages into cushion covers, while her husband thought he was resting his elbow on a depiction of St. Agnes. He was in fact applying pressure to an embroidered satire about his hunting failures. Medieval passive aggression was nothing if not tactile. It is worth noting that women's sewing circles, those gentle gatherings of velvet-clad peers and steaming herb infusions, were often less about crafting pillowcases and more about stitching together intelligence networks that rivaled entire chanceries. As cups of elderflower tea were passed from gloved hand to gloved hand, conversations drifted from fabric blends to marriage contracts, foreign cousins, uprisings in the south, and who had been seen entering the chapel with whose cousin. In the tapestry of a noblewoman's life, threads of silk ran parallel to threads of rumour, spinning through the room with quiet ferocity. Naturally, court musicians were sometimes dismissed mid-lyre when their melodies competed with a particularly biting anecdote about a friar's new boots. Gossip, after all, had rhythm too. At the heart of this rhythmic social stitching was the noblewoman's room, not quite a prison, yet not quite liberty. Often nestled within the solar, a warm upper floor soaked in southern light, when the sun could be convinced to visit. This room hosted more strategy than most war tents. There, women planned the marriages of distant relatives, interpreted dreams of suspiciously milk-related symbolism, and sometimes prayed with such intensity that even the saints might have blushed. But most of all, they embroidered truths, some pious, some pointed, and listened to the whispered politics of lace, wool, and wine. Let us not mistake quietude for dullness. The woman who appeared to be contemplating stitch length was in fact contemplating the trajectory of the House of Blois. The one who seemed overly obsessed with a floral border was likely weighing the stability of a peace treaty, or wondering if the Count had actually read the apology letter she had someone else write for him. Just as a castle's walls whispered of sieges past, the embroidery hoops whispered of hearts and households, of alliances sewn and unsewn by nimble fingers. And so, as the candle gutters and the threads are wound carefully into their boxes, we tiptoe out of the solar, leaving behind the rustle of silk and the faint sound of laughter stitched beneath breath. Beyond the heavy oak door, the next layer of noble life beckons, wrapped in parchment, sealed with wax, and perhaps just slightly scented with lavender. But not to worry, we'll unfold it quite gently, letter by letter, when the time is right. Chapter 14. The Whisper of Velvet and Vellum. Letter Writing and Lady Correspondence. In the hush between late afternoon and the lighting of tallow candles, there came a quiet flurry, subtle and dignified, like a dove rearranging its feathers. It was the noblewoman's hour of correspondence, when couriers waited with steaming horses and quills scratched purposefully across vellum. Let it never be said that medieval noblewomen lacked diplomacy, drama, or dangerous handwriting. Today, we dip into the parchment-flavored world of medieval lady letter writing. It was a pursuit more refined than embroidery, less hazardous than falconry, and on occasion, significantly more scandalous than one would expect from a woman in a wimple. You might think literacy was a rare jewel in the 12th or 13th century, and you'd be quite right for most folks. But noble women, tucked behind castle walls and bound by expectations as stiff as their brocade dresses, often had access to tutors. If not personally literate, they at least employed someone who was. A trusted chaplain, perhaps, or a worldly Frenchwoman who knew her psalms and her syntax. Letter writing became a quiet art, an emotional outlet, a political chess move, and sometimes just a bit of juicy chit-chat. A letter from one lady to another might begin with humble piety. To my most virtuous and gentle sister in Christ. But by the third sentence, it could swiftly pivot into, did you hear that the Countess of Rouen fainted at Mass when she saw the bishop's new hat? Scarlet, like sin itself. There were love letters too. Oh yes, some noble women, either bold, bored, or beautifully reckless, penned swooning lines to suitors or spouses away at war. Others may have dictated them with all the longing of a woman who's been surrounded by nuns, nettles, and Neapolitan play-by-play from court musicians for 6 months straight. These letters were often sprinkled with courtly love tropes and metaphors that now sound like something from a medieval soap opera. Wax seals were pressed with family crests over folded corners, and discreet servants scurried them along roads that were 80% mud and 20% bandit risk. Occasionally, entire diplomatic disasters bloomed from one poorly phrased turn of phrase or missing punctuation, especially in Latin. A misplaced participle could change, "I hope for peace," into something more akin to, "Your goat smells of judgment." One of our favorite examples comes from the 12th century noblewoman Héloïse, from the infamous pairing of Héloïse and Abelard. Her letters, full of philosophical arguments and poetry, show us that some medieval women were writing with more passion and intelligence than the average modern dissertation. She wrote of love, of duty, and of loss, with a voice so strong that her words still echo across the centuries like a sigh through stone corridors. Back in the more typical court, however, noblewomen used correspondence to maintain vast social networks, political allies, family obligations, birthday reminders, threats of mild vengeance over broken betrothals. Truly, the original social media, except with more wax and far fewer emojis. To write a letter was no casual thing. Vellum, prepared animal skin, was expensive. Ink could be moody, and good quill pens required plucking just the right feather from just the right goose. The scriptorium space, usually a quiet chamber facing a window, smelled of polished wood, melted sealing wax, and the occasional curiously unwashed monk. Sometimes privacy was a relative thing. A dictated letter might have an audience of 3: the noblewoman, her scribe, and the listening shadow of a mother-in-law hunched suspiciously nearby. Sigh. But every so often, a lady might write alone, the room cloaked in the soft gold of an autumn afternoon, while backgammon clacked in the parlour, and somewhere below, a cook scolded a scullery maid for setting a peacock pie too close to the fire. She dips her quill, she breathes, she writes. As the letter takes shape, line by line, it becomes a mirror of the mind, a tapestry of ink. A message across miles and months, offered with grace, and possibly a P.S. about the dismal state of Lord Montfort's dancing at Pentecost. And so, under flickering lamplight and softening parchment, we find the quiet strength of women shaping history not with swords or decrees, but with sentences. The courier waits, patient outside with steaming breath and twitching reins. The letter is sealed. A noblewoman stretches her hands with a small, well-earned smile. Now then, as the ink begins to dry and the wax cools into a perfect crest, we shall drift gently toward another dreamy duty of noble life, the not-so-thrilling management of household accounts. Chapter 15. Embroidery, Envy, and the Great Needle Crisis of 1223. Picture it now. A soft chamber, bathed in buttery candlelight, where velvet drapes muffle the sounds of distant hoofbeats and the occasional disgruntled goose. Inside, perched upright upon a carved oaken bench designed by someone who clearly hated human spines, sits Lady Melisande of Bourchier on the moss. Her needle shimmers patiently in the firelight, poised over a half-stitched griffin that looks slightly more ferret than fierce mythical beast. Yes, welcome to the gentle torment that was noblewomen's embroidery, beloved pastime, status symbol, and low-stakes battlefield of passive-aggressive courtly competition for much of medieval Europe. It was where the noblewoman could shine or unravel. You might reasonably ask, why embroidery, of all things? Well, in an era where women weren't often allowed to joust or attend university, poking things with sharp objects under the guise of artistry became an unexpectedly thrilling escape. The finer your stitches, the more refined your soul. Or so the local abbess claimed, in between interrogating the maid, who'd miscounted the flax threads. Embroidery served many noble purposes. It adorned altar cloths, cushion covers, ceremonial robes, and tapestries so grand they made modern IKEA art look like napkin doodles. You were expected to embroider everything from saints to family crests to the occasional allegorical unicorn. Some women stitched entire moral parables into pillowcases. Nothing says subtle spiritual panic like sleeping on an embroidered depiction of eternal damnation. But not all embroidery was created equal. There were techniques, you see. The bayou stitch, the split stitch, gold work, where women painstakingly attached delicate gold threads to fabric while praying they didn't sneeze. Just one wayward puff and your knight's sword suddenly became a suspicious wiggle. And heaven help you if you fell behind on fashion trends. In Lady Melisande's court, rumours once swirled that Countess Almodis had used French satin thread instead of Italian. Gasps echoed off the stone walls. One servant fainted, dramatically. Embroidery circles were the medieval nobility's equivalent of a book club, Pilates class, and bridge night all in one. Gossip travelled fast, often stitched into the very seams of wall hangings with suggestive placement of birds and oddly judgmental hair motifs. One particularly scandalous cushion, in the manner of Ethelreda the Red, showed a salamander standing beside a burned-out hearth. The metaphor was not subtle, nor was the embroidery. Let us not forget the tools of the trade. thimbles made of bronze or silver were status totems, and there was a secret yearning among many noblewomen to own a thimble encrusted with garnets. Less for practicality, more because it matched the ruby-eyed boar on their family banner. Needle cases were personal heirlooms, some engraved, others shaped like swans, dragons, or, for the tragically literal, needles. Threads were stored in satchels and boxes made of carved bone, or occasionally gifted from one noblewoman to another with notes like, "May your stitches be as tight as your virtue." These were taken both as compliments and pointed invitations to do better. But it wasn't all passive charm. Embroidery was a deeply tactile meditation, a way of reclaiming slowness in a world where the tax collector arrived with surprising punctuality and the weather ruined plans with cruelty. For Lady Melisande, the rhythm of pull and thread, of stitching the same curve of a dragon scale for hours, was a kind of rebellion, a lovely, quiet protest against the tedium of polite banquets, arranged marriages, and being asked whether she'd yet provided an heir. No, she had not. But she had embroidered an entire St. Vaclav into a Nila cushion, and somehow that felt more impressive. Truly devoted noble women would sometimes stitch inscriptions into church vestments that no one would ever see except God and the particularly attentive squirrels nesting near the chapel eaves. These hidden messages often read things like, "Let this cloth bring peace and not an itch," or "This took 3 winters and 1 broken engagement." And as evening deepened and the fire flickered low, they stitched still, shoulders aching, eyes drowsy, hearts perhaps a little lighter. Through thread and pattern, frustration flowed into fabric, joy danced in silks, and longing nestled in tiny floral borders. Now close your eyes and imagine, beneath layers of wool and linen, under centuries of dust and history, somewhere in a quiet museum, one of those tapestries still hangs. Bears with slightly crossed eyes, griffins with unintentional charm, a stitch slightly crooked where a noblewoman once sneezed and chose, for once, not to undo it. But embroidery was not the only domestic adventure that ruled the sanded floors of noble residences. There was, of course, the art of herbal infusion, equal parts scent, science, and medieval mystery. And so, dear listener, let your mind drift like a ribbon of honest linen toward a chamber where lavender steams and rose petals float, as we step softly toward the secret world of medieval noblewomen's bath rituals. Chapter 16. The Hairbrush of Power. Medieval Beauty and Quiet Rebellion. Let us sink now into the warm glow of a medieval bedroom. Not the icy, drafty sort featured in war dramas, but the quieter kind, where rushlights flicker, tapestries mumble lullabies, and a noblewoman sits before the mirror, wielding her comb with royal solemnity, like a bishop blessing the altar, except with more tangles and fewer Latin chants. Yes, tonight, we brush up against the surprisingly political world of medieval noblewomen's grooming rituals, a topic as soft as silk and just as woven with secrets. Now, one may not think of braiding hair as an act of defiance, but then again, one likely hasn't spent an entire day in a corset having to pretend to enjoy embroidery over conversation. For noblewomen, self-presentation was both an art and a negotiation, not unlike a diplomatic treaty, except the ink was rouge and the parchment, well, the face. Let's begin with hair, that halo of status and sometimes scandal. Long, uncut hair was prized in many parts of medieval Europe, symbolizing virtue, fertility, and the general ability to suffer heat stroke with elegance. Noble ladies often favored long braids twisted like cinnamon rolls, bound in ribbons of imported silk, a visual statement that said, "Yes, I do have 3 maids, and no, I do not fetch my own water." The daily routine of grooming was not a hurried matter. No slap of dry shampoo and dash out the door. This was a meditative, ceremonial act, typically carried out in the ladies' solar, a sort of medieval she-lounge situated on the sunny side of a castle. There, amid cushions and cautious sunlight, a lady would sit as her maid carefully untangled her hair with combs made of polished wood or deer antler. Yes, even the grooming tools were aristocrats. Now, cosmetics in the medieval world were simultaneously embraced and judged, as is tradition with anything fun. A porcelain complexion was the unattainable ideal, preferably achieved without any evidence of trying. Women would dab on mixtures of ground lily root, vinegar, and occasionally, brace yourself, lead. Nothing says commitment to the aesthetic quite like applying a known neurotoxin to your cheeks before prayer breakfast. But don't let the danger distract you from the formality. Makeup wasn't just vanity, it was silent language. A gentle hint of red on the lips, achieved with crushed berries or cochineal beetles, might suggest marital availability or eagerness to host a feast that featured less fish stew this time, please. Eyebrows were sculpted into oblivion, often plucked into silence to reflect piety and focus. Foreheads, in a particularly bizarre cosmetic trend, were made to appear larger by plucking the hairline an inch or 2 back. A noblewoman's forehead could sometimes rival her estate in square footage. Clothing, too, was a daily thesis statement. Though the real show was in courtly attire, even the understated garments of a morning routine whispered status. Chemises from fine linen, sometimes embroidered with floral insignia, the medieval equivalent of a designer logo. And let us take a moment for the girdle, not the restrictive kind of later centuries, but a graceful belt that cinched the waist and often held talismans or tiny books, known as girdle books, which dangled like spiritual accessories. Because who doesn't want to carry a psalm next to their hips? Jewelry, even in its absence, spoke volumes. A lady might wear a simple ring gifted by her husband, a sign of alliance, or keep it modest on purpose as an act of humility. The trick, of course, was making that modesty appear expensive. And so it was that every morning began not just with dawn's soft light brushing the towers, but with a full production of what might today be called branding. Quietly, consistently, with a gaze into the polished brass mirror and a sigh over a stubborn strand of hair, a noblewoman assembled herself for a day that may offer little excitement but much performance. Through laces tied, cheeks tinted, and silk arranged, these daily acts carved a private realm of control, a rare kind of sovereignty in a world ruled mostly by men who thought spurs solved everything. In the solitude of her solar, a noblewoman could whisper power through powder, elegance through effort, and, whether intended or not, a subtle form of rebellion through rouge. So rest now, dear listener. As the lady closes her mirror, the maid folds the linen cloths, and the last braid is secured with golden thread. For tomorrow, there are guests to greet, meals to endure, and gowns to tolerate. But tonight, our noblewoman is simply herself, painted, plucked, peaceful. Drift gently now as we make our way toward the whispering realm of noble pastimes, the curious amusements that occupied long, idle hours. Chapter 17. Embroidery, Gossip, and the Secret Language of Threads. At the heart of every stone-cold medieval castle, beyond the creaking halls and always slightly damp tapestries, there was usually a room set aside for what one could generously call quiet accomplishment. In practice, it was the chamber where noblewomen gathered, day in and day out, for what was perhaps the most deceptively powerful pastime of the Middle Ages: embroidery. To the modern eye, this may seem quaint. A few fine ladies hunched over hoops, stitching flowers onto impossibly crisp linen. But make no mistake, in the hushed focus of a noblewoman needling silk into fabric, kingdoms have been whispered about, rivalries schemed over, and the daily grind of aristocratic boredom delicately stitched away. You see, in that silent stitching circle, noblewomen found something precious: plausible deniability. Political speculations could be murmured between stitches of a highborn falcon. Family secrets passed seamlessly between threads of gold. And if a particularly judgmental peacock happened to appear on your wall hanging, well, Cousin Eleanor would hopefully understand the avian insult was lovingly accidental. Embroidery was not merely decoration. It was diary, declaration, and, in some cases, devastating social commentary. Stitching something took, a very long time. And for that very reason, women were cautious and clever about their choices. A lily might symbolize purity, a lion bravery, and a serpent, well, that usually meant something less flattering. Often directed at mother-in-laws or passing Flemish merchants with suspect moustaches. But beyond symbolism, embroidery was also a genuine status symbol. Imported silks, metallic threads, and dyes made from crushed beetles or, regrettably, snails, all showcased just how wide one's family trade network extended. Yes, snails, because nothing says prestige quite like wearing decomposed mollusk-based purple by candlelight. Of course, not all embroidery was showy or strategic. Sometimes, it really did just serve the calm of concentration. In a world with no email and very little privacy, the repetitive motion of stitch work was the medieval equivalent of deep breathing. Needle in, needle out, backstitch, half stitch, whisper about your third cousin's disappointing jousting results. It was in such sessions that friendships formed and alliances were subtly strengthened. The lady of the manor might embroider flowers while slyly recommending a tutor for the duke's daughter. Very literate, she'd whisper, shifting to a chain stitch. Terrible at chess. Nuance held in the needle. Then there was the matter of the sampler, a rather impressive and tidy fabric sheet upon which a noblewoman could showcase her stitches, alphabets, religious verses, or, depending on mood, passive-aggressive quotes about virtue. These samplers were prized, saved, and proudly displayed, often with the creator's name nestled amidst a sea of wild geese. Think of them as the medieval LinkedIn page, except more textile and less intrusive notifications. Embroidered goods were also one of the few socially sanctioned offerings a woman could make beyond her husband, especially when matchmaking loomed. A finely crafted handkerchief, adorned with tiny hounds or knotwork initials, might flutter under the nose of a visiting knight, sometimes by accident, more often with the precision of a catapult disguised as etiquette. Married noblewomen continued the craft too, often embroidering household items from altar cloths to tapestries of mild disapproval. An embroidered scene of St. Margaret slaying a dragon might hang pointedly above the fireplace after a less than romantic feast, prompting the lord of the manor to eat his mutton in reflective silence. The truly ambitious might even contribute to the grandest of all embroidered masterpieces, the tapestry. Take the Bayeux Tapestry, for example, a 68-meter cloth epic, likely directed by nuns and stitched by women, who knew that if you really wanted your take on Norman conquest preserved, best to pin it down with a thread. And yet, within all the loops and knots, there lies something rather lovely, a record of daily existence threaded by hands history often forgets. A noblewoman's embroidery was one of the few ways she could speak beyond quill and parchment. Her artistry endured moths, monarchs, and middling castles. Her stitches whispered, very politely, across the ages. As the evening draws in, and the last candle flickers beside the hoop, we'll leave these threads to rest for tonight. The thimble returns to its velvet case, the crimson threads coiled neatly beside it, and another day of deliberate artistry tucks itself into dusk. Soon, we shall drift further into the domestic labyrinth, where aroma, scandal, and spice combine in the medieval noblewoman's kitchen. Chapter 18, Parlour Pastimes and the Silken Art of Boredom. By the late afternoon, when the sun mellowed into a butter-coloured glow, and the clatter of kitchen irons gave way to the low hum of bees in the lavender bushes, medieval noblewomen gathered for a time-honoured ritual known as filling the hours. Now, it's easy for us moderns, accustomed to pings, pop-ups, and 30-second reels of cats in chainmail, to imagine medieval life as slow. But slow doesn't quite capture the deliberate, painstaking artistry of noble boredom. No, this was an era when passing time was itself an occupation, and one undertaken with the delicate skill of a sleepwalker navigating cobblestones by moonlight. Inside the manor, soft rustling signalled the start of what they called parlour pastimes. The parlour, or solar, was the warmest part of the home, and not coincidentally, the one nearest the fire. Here, embroidered tapestries sneezed out the faint scent of wool and centuries-old dust, while heavy shutters filtered the light into a velvet gloom, perfect for such thrilling pursuits as sewing. Yes, sewing. The needle was not only a domestic tool, but a weapon in the battle against ennui. Noblewomen stitched with the reverent solemnity of monks copying manuscripts. Only instead of Latin wisdom, they embroidered miniature swans, St. Barbara, and various lilies, always lilies, into cushions no one dared actually sit on. Embroidery was more than busy work. It was narrative. A noblewoman might thread her desires into the margins, a knight with suspiciously familiar cheekbones, or perhaps a castle without the very real draft problem of her own. Subtle rebellion, stitched in silk. And yet, lest you think this monotonous, consider the drama of needlework circles. Clarissa de Wexley's sampler was rumoured to contain coded commentary about the stew being watery at last Thursday's feast. Lady Edith claimed it was just a vine. But oh, what a vine! Gossip unfurled with every knot of thread. Other venerated amusements included chess, though it must be said that medieval chess is less about dazzling strategy and more about tilting pieces and quietly stewing when your rook is captured. Cards didn't yet exist in most of Europe, but backgammon was played with the same intensity one might expect from a minor border dispute. Reading, if one was literate, was its own kind of indulgence. Books were scarce, hand-copied, and heavier than a stew pot with the lid still on. Oftentimes, noblewomen were read to by soft-spoken chaplains or obliging cousins who had nothing better to do. Romances were popular, Arthurian tales, chivalric poems, and the occasional dashing knight with golden locks and an emotional range broader than valiant and mild concern. If the day permitted, music was summoned. Not summoned in any magical sense, though the sound of a lute gently plucked might genuinely summon dreams, but invited in by way of a manservant awkwardly holding a crumhorn, or a young lady with a harp as long as she was tall. Singing was expected, though not necessarily well received. Lyrics tended to involve doomed love, falcons, or, if someone got particularly bold, doomed love and falcons. The ambience was more haunting forest ballad than tavern shanty with choruses. Then there were the more exotic entertainments, falconry demonstrations, travelling minstrels, or a juggler from 3 counties over who could balance a hedgehog on his nose. Though history is silent on whether the hedgehog approved. These were rare treats, like fresh cherries in winter or a dress without moth holes. But for the most part, Lady Alienor, Lady Isabeth, and their companions quietly passed the time by sharing small talk swaddled in impeccable courtesy. A noblewoman might smilingly remark, "The rain is gentler today," which roughly translates to, "If I do not leave this sofa soon, I may dissolve into lace and irrelevance." And so, the art of boredom became its own refined skill. How to sit just so, looking contemplative, not resentful, while your wax tablet melts in your lap. How to nod as someone recounts, for the 7th time, the tale of the knight who lost his boot in a duck pond, and how to gracefully excuse oneself when the urge to scream into a tapestry becomes too strong. Yet, within this subdued landscape of needle, thread, and whispered complaint, something rare flickered. A private rebellion of thought, tiny sanctuaries of daydreams. Boredom, it turned out, was not the absence of life, but the slow brewing of wit, observation, and a future monologue that might someday wink its way into history. And as the parlour grew dim and the ladies rose with stifled yawns and stiff knees, there was the faintest thrill, for the sun was setting and the curious business of medieval sleepwear was just about to begin. Chapter 19. Petticoats and Patrons, the Quiet Power of Giving. Soft candlelight flickers on the stone walls of a chilly manor library, its slender flames performing their evening ballet in rhythms older than the family tapestries. Outside, night rests gently over the land, tucking cows into their fields and draping mist across the moors like a particularly dramatic tablecloth. Inside, however, Lady Aldrich of Lesser Grumblewick is doing something rather thrilling, for the 14th century at least. She is choosing which convent to support with her husband's money. You see, one of the quietly influential pastimes indulged in by medieval noblewomen was patronage. And no, not the sort that gets you a discount on future purchases, but the far more sedate and ecclesiastically flavoured kind. These were gifts to abbeys, commissions for illuminated manuscripts, and occasionally, if one was feeling truly daring, sponsoring a new stained glass window of St. Mildred holding a chicken. It was noble, pious, and above all, respectable. The medieval equivalent of today's hobby of curating tasteful home decor with a spreadsheet. Now, not just any woman could swan about funding monasteries. It took the right marriage, a well-stocked chest of coins, and preferably a few well-behaved children to make one eligible for ecclesiastical philanthropy. But once installed as the lady of the manor, with at least 3 copies of the Psalter memorized, a noblewoman could begin directing some of the household largesse toward worthy causes. Often, these causes were quietly strategic. Take Lady Ada of Fenwick, for example. A devoted Christian, woman with a charming fondness for goat cheese and embroidery. She made substantial donations to the Abbey of St. Gisela, not merely because she admired the abbess, who once rebuffed a Norman tax collector by hitting him with a fish, but because Lady Ada had a niece with an alarming tendency to read, and the abbey had a library. Coin met parchment, and so the niece found herself cloistered and literate, spared the fate of marriage to a man who mistook onions for apples. Such acts of giving were wrapped in piety, but threaded with quiet cunning. A noblewoman might fund a scriptorium and ask, quite casually, whether the monks might be persuaded to transcribe a genealogy that leaned ever so slightly more noble than fact allowed. Who could argue with parchment? And beyond the religious world, there were craft guilds and hospitals, more medieval than modern, though certainly earnest in effort. One Lady Ellsworth became the patroness of a small hospital in South Withering-on-the-Wold. There, she insisted the patients be allowed one warm goose feather per bed, a gift heralded far and wide as rather extravagant. The geese, it's worth noting, did not vote in her favour. But patronage was not solely the domain of wealthy dowagers. Even younger noblewomen often found small ways to contribute, particularly when securing their spiritual future. Many would arrange with local churches to have masses said for their souls well in advance, sometimes years before they even considered dying. It's a bit like scheduling your own birthday post decades ahead, just in case Wi-Fi goes out. Monks loved noblewomen's donations, often etching their names into the record books with suspicious enthusiasm. If you were particularly generous, you might even get a window seat in heaven, complete with your own halo and perhaps a lute lesson from a minor saint. If you were tight-fisted, you might still get there, but perhaps without cushions. All of this, every prayer purchased, every manuscript adorned with gold leaf thanks to gift money, was part of a medieval social dance, discreet but dazzling in its own quiet way. While the men were off hunting or jousting or accidentally starting minor wars, the women were building spiritual empires one purse string at a time. So, as Lady Aldrich narrows her choice between the Abbey of the Holy Comb and the more sainted-than-thou Priory, she hardly notices that she's part of a long, rich tradition of giving. She simply adjusts her wimple, dips her quill, and donates with grace. The candles burn lower, the night sighs, and in the drowsy hush of parchment and prayer, we drift toward the next mystery to unfold. Chapter 20. The Art of Not Dressing Oneself. Let us glide quietly now into one of the more subtly outrageous parts of a noblewoman's daily life in the Middle Ages, the delightful absurdity of never dressing oneself. For all their tapestries, manuscripts, and falconry gloves, medieval noblewomen were quite literally hands-off when it came to putting on their own clothes. And while that may sound like the epitome of luxury, imagine requiring an entire supporting cast just to get into your underwear. That is, if we define underwear by the standards of the 1300s, which consist mostly of chemises, which were sort of like pajamas made by someone who had just invented the concept of cloth. The noblewoman's day often began with the arrival of a trusted maid, or, even more glamorously, a lady-in-waiting. These were not your average fluff-and-fold types. Ladies-in-waiting were often noblewomen themselves, working what we might now call an unpaid internship in status maintenance. Their job included managing cosmetics made of suspicious substances and lacing up bodices that one hopes came with a user manual. Getting dressed wasn't just a matter of slipping into something comfortable. Oh no, this was couture before hashtags. Depending on the century, layers could include the chemise, a kirtle, stockings tied up with garters, not the saucy kind, more like ribbons with ambition, and then the overdress, possibly with trailing sleeves so voluminous that one could store an entire roast chicken in each. Not that we're suggesting anyone did, but they could have, if snacking discreetly were a social skill. Corsets, as we know them, were a later innovation, but even in the earlier Middle Ages, there were laced bodices and form-fitting garments requiring architectural consideration. The noblewoman, being laced into her clothing, had to stand very still, neither too puffed with pride nor too slouched with dread, breathing not deeply but just flatteringly. If this sounds exhausting before breakfast, it's because it was. Taking the better part of an hour or more to assemble one's silhouette was standard procedure. This of course excluded hair arrangement, which was often meritoriously committed to braids, buns or coifs, and at times imprisoned in horned headdresses so tall that entering doorways required a tilt of polite theory. Now, here's a dreamy anecdote to float upon. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the sassiest noblewomen ever to pop into the history books, was rumoured to have worn blue slippers sewn with gold and a headdress that could have functioned as a small sailboat in just the right breeze. Her wardrobe wasn't just for show. It screamed queen material before she literally became queen, twice. If clothing is a language, Eleanor was writing sonnets. Of course, this wardrobe ritual wasn't only a personal matter. It was political theatre in flounced fabric. Royal and noble women were living billboards for their family's wealth, land holdings, and ability to import fine linen without getting it seized by pirates. A carefully arranged outfit said, without uttering a medieval syllable, "My dowry is as glossy as this velvet." And let us not forget sumptuary laws. Yes, medieval governments occasionally flexed their power by dictating what noblewomen could and could not wear, depending on their husband's rank. Pearl-edged girdles, only if you were married to someone with enough horses. Crimson velvet, reserved for aristocrats not merely rich, but strategically important. These laws weren't always enforced, but the threat of being fashion policed by your neighbour's local bailiff was as real as a peacock invasion during tea time. In the heart of all this finery, one finds a paradox as soft and strange as lamb's wool mittens in July. Though these noblewomen were swathed in opulence, they were also bound by it. Fashion for them was a kind of ornamental armour. It offered esteem, it offered spectacle, but the effort required to maintain the illusion of effortless grace. That was the daily sport. So tonight, as you settle further beneath your covers, spare a gentle sigh for the medieval noblewoman, laced up like a tapestry scroll, unable to dress herself without a crew, yet every layer a feather in her family's hat. And what a hat that was. Drift now, dear dreamer, toward the quiet chambers where slippers wait by the fire and linens breathe lavender. Ahead, we'll explore the inner sanctum of feminine privacy, a medieval wonder known as the solar. Chapter 21. The Art of Doing. Absolutely nothing, but very elegantly. There's an underrated charm in doing. Well, nothing. And medieval noble women were quietly, sublimely, and exquisitely good at it, while their husbands gallivanted about with swords, tax ledgers, falcons, and occasionally gout. These patient paragons perfected the subtle, seasonal art of waiting. They waited through long winters. They waited for messengers with news from the wars, which often arrived weeks after the things they described had already happened. They waited for husbands to return from crusades, which was basically the 12th century version of playing Where's Waldo? Only Waldo is wearing chainmail and probably not coming back. And while waiting, noblewomen did what was, in its own refined way, the fullest expression of station and grace. They kept appearances. Keeping appearances was not what it sounds like. It wasn't about smiling politely once a fortnight. No, it was a full-time, full corset kind of occupation. Picture a woman seated in a high-backed oak chair that squeaks in a manner both musical and contemplative. Her hands rest lightly upon her embroidery hoop, not moving, of course. while she gazes serenely out the arrow-slit window. She's been doing this for an hour, possibly 4. You may think she's been pondering love or religion or philosophy, but more likely, she's wondering what happened to the honey cake she asked the kitchen for before Mass. In the Noble household, stillness was power, not because it influenced policy or tax reform, but because it signaled leisure. And leisure, in a society where peasants woke with the cows and slept with the chickens, was its own kind of nobility cologne. If you had time to sit still and pretend you weren't chilly beneath your brocade, then surely you had people. People who lit your fire, filled your goblet, embroidered your initials into hand towels you never touched. Only the truly significant got to sit and do nothing without being accused of sloth. Among noblewomen, elegance and inactivity went hand in embroidered glove. Now, not all doing nothing was actually nothing. Much of it was strategic presence, like attending Mass without appearing too interested, or walking very slowly through the rose garden so the servants could see your new headdress, or sitting with the household steward as he read aloud from a painfully itemized inventory of winter grain stores in Latin. The key wasn't what they were doing, it was how they weren't really doing it. Even writing letters, which might sound like a proactive pursuit, had the energy of passive refinement. Upper-class women dictated their letters aloud while a scribe quilled them onto parchment. The lady's main job, saying things like, "Write it more poetically," or "Add a bit about my good health, even if I've had the coughing weakness." In a time when literacy was still warming up its vowels, having letters sent in your name indicated not only education, but seasonal relevance. There were, of course, truly idle hours, graced with the absence of tasks and the comforting sounds of medieval life. The clop of distant hooves, the warm crackle of the fire, the maid who forgot she wasn't supposed to hum while sweeping. This was the time for musing. And noblewomen, like all those with little to do and too much time to do it, became specialists in the mild drama of the imagination. They pondered small things deeply, the symbolic meaning of a robin landing on a windowsill, the social ripples of being seen in green stockings twice in 1 week, the latent mystery of their neighbours growing rosemary, but never marjoram, which everyone knew was the superior herb. Yes, their lives could seem draped in idleness, but it was the sort of idleness draped in damask and lined with political silk. Not outward political power, no, but the quiet, decorative influence that shaped marriages, held household hierarchies in place, and made sure no visiting noblewoman ever wore a dress more breathtaking than the one they wore to last month's feast. So, while noblewomen of the medieval age may appear, from a modern perspective, to have done very little, the truth is, they did nothing, quite magnificently. And in that soft stretch of gilded nothingness, where the day begins to hum itself into twilight, and the candles flicker like they've got secrets, we'll next slip into the velvety realm of noblewomen's gardens, where pruning roses was far more political than it had any right to be. Chapter 22. The Garden, the Goose, and the Gillyflower. By the 13th century, the gardens of noblewomen had become microcosms of their time, equal parts practicality, pleasure, medicinal experimentation, and a fair bit of conversational hedging with the Almighty about the success of this year's gooseberries. Yes, dear listener, we have arrived in the realm of cabbages and courtship, of time not just in the beds but in the pot, and yes, sometimes even in the poetry. Imagine, if you will, a high-walled courtyard tucked behind a stone manor, the kind of place where echoing goat bleats serve as the midday gossip column. Sun dapples through budding pear trees, and a single Benedictine goose patrols the gravel path, like it's auditioning for knighthood. This is no overly manicured Versailles affair. This is the garden of Lady Acelina of Throckbury, 1273 AD, a noblewoman whose practical approach to planting was matched only by her insistence that even roses ought to earn their keep. To be noble in the garden was a paradox, really. Gardening was considered a lowly affair, yet many noblewomen adored tending to herbs. It was the one domestic ritual that combined fresh air, domestic power, and the illusion of solitude. You see, sitting beneath a plum tree with a trowel in one hand and a tisane made from last summer's sleepy chamomile in the other was the closest thing to spa therapy in medieval England. Or, at the very least, it was an excuse to leave embroidery circles and their withering critiques of someone's lopsided unicorn stitching. Lady Acelina's garden was simple but clever. Mint for feasts, lavender for linens, marjoram for mystery illnesses, and gillyflowers, for everything else. Gillyflowers, or dianthus, were cherished not just for their heady fragrance, but for their cheerful defiance of neglect. Much like Lady Acelina's niece, Clarice, who often wandered the garden with a book and an agenda for neither embroidery nor marriage. Fruit trees lined the edges, quince, medlar, and pear, each with an esoteric recipe hidden in the depths of the kitchen rolls. Quince paste wrapped in linen, medlar tarts with cheese, pear compote that may have just once caused a bishop to sigh poetically. And among the raised beds planted in tidy rows like monastic scribes were the true stars, the herbs. Noblewomen learned early that remedies were their domain. Physicians were expensive and occasionally wrong. It was considered entirely reasonable, almost respectable, for a lady to know which owie needed comfrey and which unsolicited visitor required a tincture that tasted like something dug out of a moated latrine. There were also flowers grown for dye, woad for blue, madder for red, and walnut husks for the deep contemplative brown that suggested someone knew Latin. Dyes were not merely cosmetic, they were economic, symbolic, and highly useful for staining robes and the occasional gossip. But beyond the practical, the garden was a space for the imagination. Courtly poems were set in blooming glades. Lovers conversed in allegorical flower beds. Even theology got involved. There were Mary gardens dedicated to the Virgin herself, filled with Marian blooms, marigold, lily, and even columbine. Stepping into one was like wandering into the appendix of a heavenly poem, scented faintly of mulch and violets. Gardens also bore social fruit. A visiting lady might be shown the new trellis, avoiding entirely the topic of the failed alliance with the Montcroix family. Men might stroll beneath espaliered apples, hoping the symbolism would do their wooing for them. That was the magic of a well-ordered medieval garden. It cultivated not just herbs, but propriety. And always, gardens opened early in spring, like sleepy dreams uncurling in the sun. Before we leave Acelina's little slice of Eden, it's worth noting that this goose, let's call her Matilda, is not only over 17 years old, but has never lost a single gardening tool to theft. Coincidence? Or the vigilant eye of poultry justice? As the sun dips behind the roof line and shadows stretch like lazy cats across the thyme, Lady Acelina gently gathers a handful of violets, not for cooking or healing, but just because they're beautiful. Sometimes, being a noblewoman wasn't about chivalry or chains of office. Sometimes, it was standing in your garden, ankle deep in parsley, watching a goose chase off the local friar, and thinking, yes, this is my realm. And perhaps, just perhaps, the next place to explore lies within those stone walls, over a tiled floor, to a tucked-away chamber where secrets swirled with spices. Chapter 23 of Piety, Pilgrimage and Paper Saints. By the time the rooster crowed in most medieval manners, the noblewoman was already up, though not necessarily out of bed. And who could blame her? Cold stone walls, drafty windows, and the occasional mouse bouncing across a windowsill like a medieval burglar. But today, we tiptoe quietly into a room warmed not just by tapestries, but by the flickering spirit of faith. Yes, tonight, we pull the threadbare curtain back on one of the quietest powers our noblewoman wielded, her piety. Not the loud, crusading kind you find in epic poetry, but the cozy, candlelit sort found kneeling in chapels, whispering Latin she only half understood, with a devotion that could humble a bishop. You see, devotion was one of the most socially acceptable passions for a medieval noblewoman, right up there with embroidery and judging the neighbours. She was expected to tend to her soul like a garden, watered with prayer, weeded with repentance, and occasionally pruned by a well-meaning friar. In many ways, religion gave Our Lady not only purpose, but paperwork. A noblewoman's spiritual calendar was more crowded than a peasant's field at a harvest. Saints' days, fasts, feast days, vigils, relic processions. She never wanted for an excuse to either abstain from butter or throw a minor feast with fish. And oh, the saints she loved, Scholastica, Dymphna, Ursula, all with more backbone than biography. These were the original girl bosses of the monastery, each with their own tale of martyrdom, chastity, or miraculous goat wrangling. The noblewoman adopted them like spiritual pen pals, praying to them for everything from fertility to good weather, to not tripping on uneven cobblestones in front of the steward. Some even kept illustrated prayer books, Book of Hours they were called, part devotion, part medieval Pinterest board. We find her now in her solar, the sun-touched chamber where important things happen slowly. She sits beside an arched window, holding a rosary of carved jet beads, her fingers fretting over each one like they might whisper their sins back to her. Above her, beams of light push through lattice windows, catching dust motes mid-waltz. Sometimes she reads scripture, translated only if she's fortunate enough to be a woman of learning, or she listens as her chaplain reads Latin aloud in a rhythm more hypnotic than meaningful. The words wash over her like warm water. Benedictus qui veni, he mutters, and she nods with respectful ambiguity. But piety wasn't just a parlour pastime. In moments of daring and reasonable weather, the noblewoman might go on pilgrimage. Not always to Jerusalem or Santiago, those were for braver knees, but somewhere more dignified and damp, perhaps a local abbey with a saint's toenail on display, or a shrine said to cure dropsy if you walked around it 12 times, clapping. She'd travel slowly, cushioned on a palfrey draped in velvet and guided by servants and clerics. A pilgrimage was a break from routine, a chance to air one's sins in a new breeze, and maybe stay in a convent along the way where the food was meagre and the silence aggressive. Still, it was its own kind of freedom, a journey she undertook under the twinned flags of devotion and nobility. Back in her home chapel, which often doubled as a spiritual parlour, less tea, more incense, she might sponsor a mass or two, perhaps have prayers said for her late husband, even if he was only late to dinner. Endowments to local priories were common, as was donating unflattering art of one's family to be hung near the altar, ensuring eternal salvation, or, at very least, posthumous exaggeration. Lest this all seem too pure, let us remember, religious devotion also came with flair. Lavish processions, embroidered vestments more opulent than a peacock's dream journal, and reliquaries shaped like jeweled fingers or, in one alarming case, a bejeweled nose. The noblewoman adored the pageantry. Heaven, after all, was full of thrones and trumpets, and tucked behind it all, that curious mix of genuine belief and social expectation. Because faith was not a separate part of life in the Middle Ages. It was the air, the backdrop, the breakfast conversation. As she kneels one last time before bed, whispering the same prayer she's said since girlhood, we see it clearly. A life deeply ordinary in its extraordinariness. Just a woman, in a world both suffocating and sacred, seeking solace in the divine pattern she could follow. Now, as the altar candles flicker low and the chapel bells echo dimly through stone, let us gently close the door on this quiet sanctum of medieval devotion. We'll next wander through the most sacred chamber of all, her bedchamber, and the astonishing amount of time she spent inside it. Chapter 24. Of linen sheets, laudanum dreams, and the quiet triumph of boredom. And so, dear dreamer, we come to the gentle gloaming of our tale, the final elapsing hour of the medieval noblewoman's most underappreciated realm, nighttime. After a long day of supervising embroideries, failing to read Latin by candlelight, and occasionally being discouraged from spontaneous dancing in the courtyard, Our Lady of the Manor would finally retire to what passed, in the year of our Lord 1307, as restful opulence. Her bedchamber was not simply a bedroom. It was a proclamation of wealth, piety, and mild draughts. The feather mattress, stuffed with actual feathers, plucked by hand from geese that were very likely outraged, sat atop a sturdy wooden frame often carved by someone who firmly believed in plaid armor and sad angels. Before our noblewoman even reached the bed, quite the reverse fashion parade took place. Off came the outer kirtle, often with the help of a maid who knew more secrets than several confessors combined. Then the chemise, delicately laundered with lye and a prayer, smoothed down against petticoat-warm skin. All the while, her hair, tightly braided or bound under a veil all blessed day, was finally released in a tender cascade, signaling bedtime to everyone, including the candle. Now, medieval hygiene standards have often been sniffed at by modern noses, but this is unfair. Noblewomen bathed as often as society, firewood, and time allowed, sometimes even once a month. Quite the indulgence. On occasion, a warm tub would be hauled into the room, essentially a barrel for reclining, lined with linens, filled with rose-scented water if the roses were in bloom, and the cook was in a generous mood. But even on most nights, a noblewoman's ablutions were intimate and fragrant affairs. Warm cloths soaked in herbs like lavender and marjoram dabbed at wrists, throat, and behind the ears. The sort of quaint spa routine that modern influencers would market as forest-core skin rituals. Then came the bed. A canopy bed, naturally. Not just for visual flair, but for highly practical reasons, such as preventing spiders the size of a spoonful from descending directly onto your face from the rafters. Curtains were drawn to keep in warmth and, metaphorically speaking, dreams. As she slipped beneath embroidered covers, the handiwork of sisters, mothers, and very patient nuns, she may have whispered a prayer to Saint Hildegard, the popular patroness of musicians, mystics, and medieval multitaskers. Or perhaps she would murmur the latest gossip from the dovecote to her lady's maid, who was already half asleep and dreaming of oatcakes. Medieval nights were dark, dear listener. Really, truly dark. With not a single outdoor street lamp, light pollution was unheard of, and the constellations made their full, luminous presence known. Beyond the curtained bed was a silence so deep it felt like velvet. Owls hooted, mice rustled under floorboards, and the wind tapped gently against the beams as though it too wished for sanctuary. Now, you might think a noblewoman's dreams were filled with courtly intrigue, illuminated manuscripts, or chivalrous knights with flowing locks and even flowier poetry. Instead, her REM cycle likely brought visions of dry grain harvests, manageable gout, and perhaps a new dowry chest large enough to hold all the good napkins. And sleep, for her, was both an escape and a ceremony. Some noblewomen sipped poppy syrup at night, laudanum in early forms distilled from flower petals and cloaked in honey, to hush the aches of gouty joints or wandering thoughts. Dreams, thus enhanced, might gallop gently across rolling moors, past hedge mazes, and through halls hung with tapestry. We end our journey as the flickering candle stutters one last puff of golden breath, and all becomes still. The manor sighs, the fire settles into coals, and the noblewoman, tucked within layers of linen and wool, drifts without effort into dreams of distant gardens that bore no weeds, of banquets with lemon sugar sweets, and of a world that, for all its duties and discomforts, still allowed her quiet purpose. For now, dear heart, close your eyes as gently as a medieval gate at dusk. Let the uncertainty of the pestilence, the politics, the poultry, they can all wait till sunrise. Sleep in peace, under canopy dreams, with the whisper of silk and sandalwood around you. Good night.